Hello once again and welcome to Behind the Grind. I'm Matt Donnelly, and on today's show, we welcome the senior software engineer and lead fantasy analyst for PFF. He's one of the most accurate expert rankers in the game, and he has the badges to prove it. He's the one and only Nathan Jahnke. How you doing, Nathan?
I'm doing well. Thank you for that intro. And yes, I have all the in-season trophies behind me to back it up, but you have one of those draft trophies that I hopefully will get one of these years.
I think I slid in that 1 year that maybe you slid out. I think mine's 2021 officially. So it's weird because you don't get until like 2022. So it kind of throws you off on how it all breaks down. But it's nice little bragging rights. And
oh yeah,
3 trophies are better than 1. So I got some work to do. I mean, it's really a testament to people like yourself, Paul Fitzmaurice there, guys, Rob Wozniak, guys who have done it consistently over a 3, 4, 5, 6 year period, because it's not easy to finish top 5 with any kind of consistency, let alone year in and year out. I mean, 1 time, that's congratulations, good job. 3 times, 4 times, well, that's another level altogether.
Oh, yeah, there's a couple guys who just year after year, John Paulson, Justin Boone, Joe Bond, Pat Thorman as well, just guys that year after year, I'm like always competing with every week, seeing not just where I rank, but where those guys are ranking each week too, because those are the guys I know I have to worry about.
So you do a lot of scoreboard watching then in season to see where you're kind of stacking up then, eh?
Yeah, just end of the week when they announce the end of week accuracy, and like it's so hard week in and week out. Like you could have just one bad week and it feels terrible, but you just know that's how fantasy football is. You can have a great week, you could have a bad week. That's part of the fun of it, is that there is that randomness, that you can't just be like spend all your time, get really good, and you're automatically better than everyone else all the time. That would make it a little more boring, but because of the way fantasy football is, there's everyone always at least has some chance.
And even more impressive is, like you said, it's week in and week out. This one here is from the draft. So this was like beginning of the season, second most accurate when all's said and done. That's week in and week out. That takes a lot of work. I mean, I know people have got like formulas, they punch into these spreadsheets and this, that. I was throwing things off the wall and seeing what stuck. I mean, that's how I did my rankings. There was no scientific approach to it at all. I know you've got a process, though.
Yeah, definitely have a background in actuary science and statistics. So, and working at PFF, of course, we have a ton of data to work with. So definitely have lots of formulas and stuff to figure everything out, or at least try to.
Well, I feel like I'm at a disadvantage here when it comes to that. But you know what? Enough about me. Enough about that. We'll probably circle back at some point, I'm sure. But we always love to start this show off. It's kind of a bit of an icebreaker here, but hey, if you pay attention to baseball, if you're coming in the bottom of the 9th inning to close out a game a la Mariano Rivera, if you're coming to the WWE ring like Hulk Hogan here, what is that intro music for the Yankster himself? What do you got there? Jansker, whatever you... Man, my accent's probably throwing everything off here, but what's that intro music going to be for you, Nate?
So I probably spent too much of my day thinking of this, since I was going back and watching the film of the last couple episodes, since I like watching the film. And I thought of some like, let's do some Taylor Swift to try throwing off my opponent. Let's try some of the Kendrick Lamar, his recent stuff against Drake, to really get in the opponent's head. But then my mind went to The Lonely Island and how much fun it would be going out to like I'm on a Boat by The Lonely Island. And it's still like hype up music. It's like a parody-ish song, but it still has that energy to the song that you want going out there. So I'm thinking I'm on a Boat's my final answer, even though I was really considering Jack Sparrow by The Lonely Island as well.
Well, we encourage singing. You want to throw a few riffs at us here? A little Lonely Boat action?
I think I'm good. I think I want to at least keep the language PG just in case any kids are watching, and that is definitely not a PG song. And singing is not one of my talents.
Well, it's probably true. My kids probably will go back and watch this a little bit later. I usually do something stupid every show that they kind of hold over my head at some point in my life. So, I mean, I've got a laundry list of things, but we also got guilty pleasure songs. I know you're kind of familiar with that. Maybe that is that Taylor Swift right there. I've got kids. I've got Bubble Guppy. I mean, I've heard it all. There's a song, it'll get stuck in my head. It's there for 2-3 weeks until it's out of there. What is that guilty pleasure song that you got going on right now?
So it's probably more recent stuff. I still listen to top 40. I don't spend a lot of time like when I'm at home listening to music. So it's mostly when I'm in the car, I'll just turn the radio on to top 40 stations. So there's a lot of stuff that I enjoy right now. Stick Season is one that gets stuck in my head a lot. Even stuff like Sabrina Carpenter, Olivia Rodrigo, some of the songs that they have out recently. So that's probably more guilty pleasure than like songs that are still considered guilty pleasure, but have been around for a while that like everyone secretly likes at least.
Well, it makes you feel better. All my top 40 songs are from the 80s and 90s. So, I mean, this new stuff, I can't quite get behind. I don't know much about it. So, one thing I do know about is sports always plays an integral part of each and every one of our lives. Whether you want to go into fantasy analysis, whatever that might be, even as a kid. But so how did you get into sports?
So as a young kid, I was able to try a lot of different sports. Soccer was the one that stuck the most when I was younger. On the same team for about 8 years, but like I tried baseball and I did not know that I needed glasses at the time. So I was trying to hit the ball without being able to see. That does not go very well. Basketball, tried that for a couple years. Then eventually tried out football, tried it for 2 years, broke my arm my first year. And second year, my freshman year of high school, I was the lightest one on the lightweight team. So my body just could not handle the grind of football whatsoever the way that I was built then. So I tried football. It didn't go very well. And then tennis is another one where it was just a sport that my friends were into playing. And just like over summers would go to the local pool. There was a tennis court there. So we just play basically every day over a couple summers. So I played a bit of tennis in high school.
So when you're in that sand lot or the tennis court or whatever it might be, football field, what was that athlete that you trying to become? Because, I mean, we've all done it. I mean, up here in Canada, we've all had the Game 7 Stanley Cup moment there on the outdoor rink where we've pretended to be clearly someone much better than we happen to be. Is there someone that you tried to be? Like, who are some of those favorite players that maybe your favorite teams growing up?
Sure. So in terms of watching sports, it was mostly just football and basketball. Football, the position that I enjoyed the most was defensive end. I did have a spin move that worked at least some of the time. So having Reggie White, I grew up in Madison, Wisconsin. So Packers fan around the 90s when they were winning that first Super Bowl in the 90s, at least. So Reggie White was someone that I looked up to because he was a great pass rusher, and that's what I enjoyed doing. And then obvious answer, but Michael Jordan, since this was peak Michael Jordan era when I was playing basketball. So everyone wanted to be like Mike.
So how many times was that tongue sticking out when you went up for a layup? Every time, right? Every single time, right?
For sure. I didn't get very many shots off because I was more good at defense and passing the ball. But when I did shoot the ball, you had to.
Hey, we all have our strengths and weaknesses, but the one thing that always sticks is how sports has developed us as a kid. Maybe some of those life lessons from those early childhood sports. Is there maybe a lesson or a coach that maybe said something to you that stuck with you even to this day to your job there with PFF? Maybe a piece of advice maybe that they gave you.
Probably one lesson. My dad was either my assistant coach or head coach for soccer for 8 years. And by the end of it, I knew football is something that I more so loved. So there was one time where there was supposed to be a soccer game, but I wanted to watch the NFL draft since I had watched it the couple years before. And that was like the one time my dad was probably ever, or at least openly disappointed in me because I made a commitment to my team, but I wanted to do the NFL draft stuff and watch that. So it was a lesson in prioritizing and making sure that the commitments that I was making were towards things that I wanted to be doing, and making sure that if I'm making a commitment, especially to other players, in this case, it would have been my teammates, that I'm holding up to that, because if not, I'm letting them down and I shouldn't be doing that. So even though in the end, I probably made the right choice of watching the NFL draft because that ended up being my career choices and everything way down the line, but it was still a lesson to learn that if I wanted to choose the NFL draft, then maybe I shouldn't have been doing soccer that year.
That whole we before me type mentality there when it comes to coaching. Now, I was never fortunate enough to have my father coaching, or maybe I was fortunate not to have him coaching, but I've also coached all my kids in a variety of different sports. Mm-hmm. So as someone who had your father coaching you, how was that relationship maybe on and off the field? Was it something that you look back on and you're like, yeah, you know what, I'm glad that happened? Or is it one of those things like at the time you're like, oh man, because I know I'm probably a little bit more difficult on my kids than maybe the rest of the kids when it comes to actually the coaching, the fundamentals of the game.
Yeah, I think it was a positive because it was just an opportunity to spend time with him since he worked a lot as well. So he was good at what he did. Was also a computer programmer. So being able to spend time with him that way was good. He wasn't someone that was overly harsh on really anyone on the team, but also wasn't harsh on me, treated me fairly with the team. So like, if anything, maybe it was a little more difficult just in that in other sports he was more focused on me, so he could spend more time specifically on what I was doing, and therefore with soccer he had to spend more time with everyone else there rather than just me. But I think overall it was a positive experience. He treated me fairly and wasn't overly harsh or anything like that, so it was a positive experience.
All right. So one positive experience that I didn't have is when I do my internet stalking of my guests, I can usually go back on their Twitter and come up with something. Your Twitter is very consistently analytical. I mean, it is very much stats driven. This. There's like no peek behind that iron curtain or anything going on there. So if your fantasy football style was a brand, what would your motto be?
See, I tried to think of answers to questions ahead of time, but you haven't asked this question on the last couple episodes, so I have to think about it.
No, I like to throw a curveball in there every once in a while. I got to keep my guests guessing here.
Could you repeat the question?
If your fantasy football style was a brand, what would your motto be?
If it was a brand, what would my motto be?
Like Nike has that just do it type thing.
Okay.
So if Nathan Jahnke had a brand, what would your motto be?
It would have to be something about trying to be the best, because I'm with fantasy football accuracy. That's probably what I pride myself the most on, is trying to be consistent week in and week out that someone can trust with their rankings. And so it would something like aiming for perfection. So trying to be like, you're never going to be perfect predicting football stuff. Injuries happen. All this stuff will always happen, but trying to be as close as I possibly can. So aiming for perfection is probably what I'd have be as the model.
I'm drawing a blank here, but there's that one thing, better than all the rest. Maybe that's what it is there. A little bit of harmony there, a little bit of a show tune, a little bit of a jingle, so to speak.
Oh yeah, one of the songs that I was thinking at potentially for my intro song as well was "The Greatest" by Sia, and I think Kendrick Lamar also was featured on that at one point. But I was thinking so much of like, how do I want to get into my opponent's head? And if I have a song where I'm saying I'm the greatest, then that's going to motivate them, and I'm not trying to motivate them, trying to motivate me. So, but that was a thought that I had for a potential song.
See, my secret is just trying to out crazy the crazies, because we know how crazy fantasy analysts and fantasy managers can be. My goal is just be crazier than those guys. And I think you do a pretty good job at that every now and then. And this next question may prove it. So we know that it's almost NFL season. I mean, people get crazy during the offseason. All kinds of things come up. We see thighs going on. Guys in shorts, their thighs are out there, and boom, right up the rankings they go. Hey, I'm guilty of this. I mean, I've been there and done that. Now, when you were starting your journey, essentially collecting that data, way back when, like with PFF, way back when, what were the challenges back then, and how did you kind of make sure that you were getting the right data for the right players? Because you couldn't always see the names and numbers on the back of the jersey. So maybe you weren't looking at thighs, but you must have had something you were looking at.
Oh, yeah. So I started as a player participation analyst, where I was keeping track of who was on the field, where they lined up, and what they did on the play. I know you've had a number of guests on this show that have done the similar thing. So I was doing this for 5 or 6 years. I was in charge of it for a while. And at one point, very early on, I was doing probably half of the NFL games each week. So I was really getting to know all of the players. So a lot of it was shoes and socks, what color their shoes were, if there were any logos on their shoe, how high up their socks were, if they like didn't have any visible socks. That was a huge thing to start off looking at. Then especially with receivers, tight ends, looking at gloves, especially looking at stances. One that I always enjoyed was the Bears. They had Johnny Knox and Devin Hester at wide receiver. One of them always had their hands up like this, and then one always had their hands at the side. So all I had to do was look at their arms to see which wide receiver was which. But it gets to a point where if you're doing a team time after time again, some of it just becomes second nature. You don't even remember what you're looking at or looking for. But you just recognize that player as that player and you don't need to know it. And there's like obvious things like skin color. If the guy has tattoos, if someone's wearing sleeves, that makes it really obvious. Like the Packers back in those days, Jordy Nelson was their white wide receiver. That made it easy. James Jones, like wearing sleeves a lot. That made it really easy for him. Andrew Corliss had a bunch of tattoos. That made it easy to recognize him. But all these little things just to tell these players apart, because you're trying to do this as quickly as possible. And since I'm tweeting out those snap counts and I want to tweet it out live and everything, I need to be able to get this done as quickly as possible. So it's trying to memorize all this stuff in order to collect it quickly and before the ball is even snapped, before you see the jersey numbers, because everyone starts moving around at that point.
I mean, nowadays we have the all 22 that kind of changes the way that we look at it, but maybe that's kind of changed how we've kind of looked at fantasy football, especially as it was for data, whatever you want to call it, collection wise. I mean, we all say it differently. I mean, I say it both ways all the time, so I really don't have one way or the other that I go with, but let's talk about maybe a change for you, a decision that changed the trajectory of your life.
Probably the biggest one that at least somewhat relates to my career is in college, was already in my senior year. And that's when I decided to change majors. Prior to me changing, I was an education major. My background has always been in math. So I was planning on being a high school math teacher and probably a football coach on the side, since I wanted to do something in football. At the time, there was slowly starting to be some kind of analytics in football. Football Outsiders was doing their thing. Brian Burke, before he worked at ESPN, he had his own website. Pro Football Reference had a blog that they were doing. So there was starting to be some kind of stuff where people were doing numbers with football. And I was very interested in that. And this was 2009, and I was a game charter for Football Outsiders that year. And I decided to change majors to actuary science to learn more of the statistics, since part of me wanting to change as well is when I wanted to be a teacher, I was really excited to work with students who enjoyed math and just wanted to learn more about it. And the more that I thought about it and more I took classes, the more I realized most of my time would be focused on the people who didn't want to learn math and trying to get them excited. And that wasn't as appealing to me. So I basically waited to the last minute, the day before I had to decide what classes I was taking next semester, because I had to either take a bunch of classes that were education based or actuary science based. So that was probably the biggest decision that I made that like really changed the trajectory, since had I not changed it, I probably would have had a job rather than starting at PFF, and probably would not have joined at the right time and would have had a very different life right now.
When did you start at PFF?
So PFF, I started 2010, so I was still in college at the time. They had a post about how they were putting things behind a paywall, and at the end of it, they said they were looking for volunteers for data collection. And I'm like, okay, if I volunteer here, then I don't have to pay for the data because I can't afford it. I'm a college student at the time. So I'm like, okay, if I work for them, then I get to do that. And they were very welcoming. And it was very clear that like great things were going to happen in the company. So I'm very glad that I got in when I did. So I've been at PFF for 13, 14 seasons now.
That's today's day and age. People don't stick around for 14 years with one organization. I mean, there's so many different fantasy football sites out there and this and that. So 14 years is quite impressive. Now, we've all heard about the coaching trees that are out there. PFF has quite the coaching tree itself, from guys like yourself, obviously, Ratcliffe, Scott Barrett. I think Wetfield was there for a while too. Mike Clay. I popped on, I think it was the Fantasy Slant, and that was 2016-ish. First off, you haven't aged since 2016, so I'm not convinced that you're not some sort of vampire either at this point. But it was kind of funny because I went back, I looked at a young Scott Barrett, and I'm like, dude, I'm saving this picture for later. This is coming up at some point when I see it next time. But it's quite the collection. If you see everyone who's come up through PFF and kind of moved on, what they've been able to accomplish, they may have one of the best coaching trees to this day. Now, there's some other organizations and other fantasy sites that are building a very good team themselves, but that coaching tree. Kind of talk about that for a second.
Yeah, it's been great to be able to work with so many people. Mike Clay basically started the fantasy side of PFF 2010, the same year I joined. So I kind of got lucky in that after the 2010 season, I basically just asked, hey, can I get involved with this? And he said yes. So my barrier to entry into fantasy was so much easier than what people have it these days. But we had a great team very early on. Jeff Radcliffe was also there from the beginning. And then Jeff Radcliffe kind of took the lead once Mike left, but we have so many people that are various places. Scott Spread as well, Tyler Lochner, basically a lot of the people at Fantasy Life, Ian Hartitz, Dwayne McFarland, Kendall, who was just on the show, also from PFF, Daniel Kelly, who's an editor with Jeff still. So it's been great to work with so many different people because I've been able to like pick their brain while they've been at PFF. And then a lot of them have been able to go off and do bigger and better things than what they could have at PFF. So it's been great to have worked with so many people, and basically anywhere you look, any major website has at least some people who at one point were a fantasy analyst at PFF. So it's great to have those connections as well, just people that I know I can reach out to wherever, just to talk fantasy football or be in leagues with them or anything like that.
It really is special, especially when you have a journey that stretches back to 2010. Mm-hmm. Now, when you've been in this game as long as you have there, things have changed. There's been all kinds of challenges. So what are some of the biggest changes and challenges for yourself in that span of 14 years?
Biggest changes, I would say, are basically there's a lot more options out there for people who want to enjoy fantasy football. If you want to get really, really invested, like Dynasty has gotten more and more prevalent over the years. If you want to go like even deeper into football nerdom, you can go and do Devy leagues as well. I've been in a Devy league and it's been a lot of fun getting some of those college kids who are like freshmen or sophomores and getting them on my team a couple years later. IDP has become more prevalent, various scoring systems. So there's so much more customizability there. And then you throw in best ball for people who just want to do the draft and not have to worry about other stuff. You have DFS if you don't want to worry about the draft and just want to worry about 1 week of time. And then sports betting and DFS all kind of go along with that. And you can get so creative on some of these sites as well. Like one of the most fun leagues I've been in the past couple of years are the Guillotine League that I've been in, which for those who don't know those leagues, it's each week it's more or less like a redraft league with a couple more teams, but then whichever team has the lowest amount of points, their team gets eliminated from the league. All of their players go off the waiver wire. So waiver wire strategy is completely different because all of these players who will never be on the waiver wire in any other kind of league will be on the waiver wire. So there's a whole different strategy to who you're drafting, because instead of it being these high upside players, it's I want these consistent guys who aren't going to lose me the week. And then knowing that, hey, if I don't get really good wide receivers to start out with, I can get guys off the waiver wire later and they'll be available at some point in time. And then it's a whole lot of waiver allocation of, do I want to save it more for the end? Do I want to spend a lot early? How is my team doing? So I think options are the biggest thing in terms of what's changed in the industry. I think challenges, there's just so many more people who want to get involved in fantasy football. There's so many sites that have popped up over the years and just different ways that people consume their fantasy football information, whether it's TikTok or YouTube, or if they still prefer written content, or if they just want to go on Twitter or X and not actually read articles, but just see what people are saying on there. There's so many different ways that people want to consume it, that if you want to try reaching as many people as you can, then you have to be involved in a lot of different things to try reaching all of those different people.
It really is. I know, talking to some of the old timers there, the pioneers of the industry, completely different back then compared to how it is now. I mean, if you've got a microphone and a camera, you could be like me and just actually do a podcast without really any background in sports media, so to speak, right? Where I know Tara, who's usually with us, she's got that sports media background that she never really got to use until fantasy football came along, and now she's crushing it everywhere she goes. Now, we know that you've been crushing the analytics when it comes to PFF for quite some time. but tell me something that maybe other people don't realize about you.
Let's see. One, I am a big Power Rangers fan. People who have worked at me at PFF know this, but I probably haven't shared it too much on social media or on too many other podcasts, at least. I started watching Power Rangers when I was 5, when a lot of other people did. And then after those first 2 or 3 years, people slowly started dropping off and stopped watching it. But I just kept going, and it's gone on for 30 years now. There's no show this year. It's the first time in the 30 years that there hasn't been one, but I kept going and enjoyed it. So my favorite superhero, probably the Power Rangers. So that's probably one thing that people don't know as much about me, and something that I enjoy in my free time.
And speaking of that free time, what are the other hobbies you have to kind of take yourself away from fantasy football? Because I mean, I look at numbers for 5-10 minutes and my head starts to spin. I mean, this is something you do all the time. You got to need a break at some point, right?
Yeah, I try in spring and summer to at least go for a walk every day for at least a half hour. The main thing that gets me to do it is I get back into Pokemon Go every spring and summer. I stop playing once you get far enough into football season, but especially like I was doing that a couple hours ago, just going for a walk and playing, even though it's still a screen in front of me, I'm playing Pokemon on my phone while I'm going for a walk, but I'm at least getting outside and getting away from fantasy football and everything for at least a little bit, because now we're really starting to get to the time where things will get crazy in a month or so.
All right. Well, you know what? One thing I'm glad you kind of mentioned there is your love for the Power Rangers. Are you familiar with how blind rankings work? I mean, we've seen them out there a few times. There's some TikToks out there. You're familiar with that. So I'm going to kind of pull it together. We're going to do a blind rankings of the original Power Rangers group. So it's not just the Power Rangers here. I may be throwing some curveballs in here as well. So right off the get-go, you ready? You ready for this one? Anyone from the 90s, you know what they're thinking here. Kimberly Hart, the Pink Power Ranger. Where does she rank for you? 1 through 5.
So she is great. She was a really good character. She stayed on for a couple of years. There's been some great Power Ranger comics over the past 8 years, which has really grown her character. The actress who played her is even doing a comic right now for Power Rangers, so that's been great. I think I will stay safe and put her right in the middle at 3. Since there are some characters that I did enjoy more, but she was a very, very good character.
She had the attention of many youths back in the day. Now, how about Lord Zed? Where do you got him?
Lord Zed, he was so much fun when he was introduced. One of the best villains that Power Rangers ever had. I think I will put him at 2. I think I want to leave the top spot, and hopefully one of these next 3 will be good enough for that top spot, and hopefully there aren't too many other excellent characters that I regretfully will have to put them at 4 and 5.
Oh, there will be regretful decisions at some point. There will definitely be some regret in this episode. Now, the next one up here, Jason Lee Scott, the Red Power Ranger.
So I enjoyed his character a lot on the show, but I'm going to put him at 5, mostly because the actor has said and done some questionable things in the past couple years that I don't need to get into on the show, but just with what the actor has done, that's left a pretty sour taste in my mouth on his character.
All right, we've got number 1 and number 4. This is actually shaping up pretty good. So the next one up here, the Green Power Ranger, Tommy Oliver.
I have to put him at number 1. His love for Power Rangers has really helped keep the brand alive throughout all the years. He was on the show for a good 5 years. Initially, he came back for 3 or 4 different reunions over the years. He came back for an entire season at one point of time. Met plenty of these people at conventions over time, but he is always great at those kind of things. Met him at one of them. He always makes sure to stay for as long as he needs to make sure he could see all of his fans. Unfortunately, the actor has passed away, but when you think of Power Rangers, he's the first person that everyone thinks of, and he's the first person that everyone should think of when you think of Power Rangers.
Absolutely there. And again, number 4, maybe the most underrated duo when it comes to the Power Rangers, that is Bulk and Skull.
Okay, so yeah, Bulk and Skull, we have to put them at 4. If I knew everything ahead of time, I probably would have put them at 3 over Kim. Just those two together are so great, and similarly, like they've stuck around forever on the show. They stayed around for 5+ years. One of them 6 years, and then came back again. And they're at conventions are always great as well. Like the big Power Ranger convention they do, it's every 2 years. They typically like end the show with the comedy routine, even though they both have gone off and done other stuff with their careers. But whenever they're back together, they're still so great.
You really can't have one without the other, can you? You can't just have Bulk. You can't just have Skull. They have to be together.
Mm-hmm.
And then who would I miss? Because I mean, Rita was a big part of the whole Power Rangers thing back in the day. As we talk about the villains, who else should I have had in this as far as the cast of characters are concerned?
Yeah, well, you definitely had like the 3 biggest Rangers, but Zach, Billy, and Trini were all good, fun characters from the original season. Like you said, Rita. I think the top other people to probably potentially include, if we had more than 5, was Zordon and Alpha 5, since those were pretty iconic characters. Zordon, the big head in the tube, and then Alpha, the robot, his assistant. They were both enjoyable characters and definitely interesting that you wouldn't see on other shows at the time, at least.
So we know that the Power Rangers were kind of that 90s type superhero routine there. And one thing I did notice is the PFF Fantasy podcast was very video game-esque in its presentation there. So what are some of your favorite maybe 90s video games? Is there something really, video games that really stood out to you as part of your youth?
Sure. So growing up, we had the original Nintendo. That was the main thing initially, where Super Mario 3 was probably my favorite game to play on that. Played a ton of Super Mario 3 growing up. Unfortunately, did not have the Super Nintendo, so don't have much nostalgia over those games, but then did have the Nintendo 64, all the classics there, Mario 64, Mario Kart, Star Fox 64. There was a Donkey Kong game that I enjoyed, a Banjo-Kazooie. So that was really my introduction to a lot of the Nintendo-ish characters. Super Smash Brothers, I'm not sure if that was still in the 90s or just after, but Super Smash Brothers was a ton of fun as well.
Was there ever a Power Rangers video game? I can't think of one.
There over the years there haven't been many great ones. Like there have been ones, but the biggest one is probably just a game you can play on your phone. It's been going on for 6 or 7 years, where every month or so they're adding a new character. It's just a fighting game where you can fight someone else who has the game online. All the characters have unique move sets, so it's a pretty fun game just for your phone. Ideally, at some point in time, they'd have some cool RPG like game for Power Rangers, but they just haven't made one of those yet.
Fair enough. Now, say maybe you weren't making a video game, although I think your background, you probably could code something up there. But let's say you wrote a book about your career. What would the title be and why? And there's a curveball for you. That's not on the other show sheets. This is a new one.
This is a new one. And Matthew Collier, who is a writer in Minnesota, writes about the Vikings. He wrote a book on the history of PFF. So there actually has been a book already. It's not fully about me. There's only a couple pages with my story in it. So some of it already exists, but if we needed a book that was entirely about me, probably the one that I knew I went with earlier in my life was the spreadsheet of my life, since I used to have a spreadsheet journal where every row was a day and I had a bunch of columns where I could categorize things, whether it was a sporting event or something that I did with a group of friends. So I could easily go back and find all the times that I either like went to a sporting event or did whatever with friends, and like kept it as a journal as well, where I had notes that I would keep about my day like you would have for a journal, but it was in a note in a spreadsheet tab rather than in a more typical journal. So it's not something that I've kept up with as well after I left college, but earlier in my life, that's something that I kept track of and I think would be a fun thing to have. So since spreadsheets are something haven't used as much over time now that I've gotten more into programming and using R and Python and those kind of things. So I haven't kept up with spreadsheets as much, but that used to be something associated with me, with my friends and stuff. So I think the spreadsheet of my life would be a good title.
All right. Well, it started off in college, being that poor college student, starting to head over to PFF there, getting that little toss in there for the little, hey, I'm working at PFF. I want to get the free subscription sort of thing there. Now, with all that, what point did you decide that maybe I can make a run at this? I mean, you got in there pretty quick after college, after the education, but it wasn't full time, I imagine, right off the get-go back in 2010. When did you decide that, you know what, I can make a run at this? And when did you think it was going to happen for you?
Sure. So 2010 was my first year doing data collection while I was still in college, and I just made the career switch to actuary. So I was doing one game a week to start with. I think by the second or third week of the season, I was already asked to start doing 2 games a week. And at this point, it was just volunteering. And then once I got to winter break for college, like right now for all of the games we do for player participation, we have 2 people doing it and then 1 person checking all the differences between the 2. Back then, we were trying to get every game done twice, but we just didn't have the manpower for it. So once I got to winter break, I'm like, okay, let's see how many games that I can do. So I was doing 6 games a week for those last couple weeks of the season, just to like push myself, see how much I can do, and kind of show that, hey, this is something that I want to be doing. And I was the most accurate person in the company outside of the founder, Neil Hornsby, my first year at player participation. So then by 2011, I had just graduated college and I had an internship, actuary internship. But at that time, I already knew that PFF is what I wanted to be doing. So that fall, I basically treated it as my full-time job. I was getting paid per game, and I was often being the highest paid employee because all of the people who were doing it as a salaried employee, which was only like 3 people, they got paid a certain amount, where for me, the more games I did, the more I got paid. So I did as many games as I possibly could, and like continuing to like wake up early on a Wednesday morning at like 4 or 5 a.m., even though I had just done 7 games the previous 3 days just to get one more game in and those kind of things. So by 2011, I knew it's what I wanted to do. 2012, in summer, like I had the conversation way before that, but 2012 is when I got offered a full-time position. So 2012 is when I knew that this is something I could be doing. But like over my course of my time at PFF, I've been doing so many different things that like fantasy football wasn't necessarily what I was getting hired to do. Fantasy football was something I was doing more on and off. And then about 5 years ago, when Jeff Radcliffe left and Scott Barrett left, that's when I made fantasy football at least 50% of what I was doing at PFF.
All right. And I mean, I can't even imagine the type of discipline it takes to chart an entire game and then to chart a second game and a third game and a fourth game, because it takes a lot of discipline to commit to that. So tell me about maybe an obstacle or a personal challenge that you've had to overcome in this industry.
So yeah, going with the discipline, like for me, I enjoyed it so much, and I always tried to make sure that I was learning. So that's part of how I was able to do it. Of like, I wanted to know how these wide receivers were rotating in and out, how these running backs were rotating in and out. I cared a lot more about defense at the time because I wasn't doing fantasy football so much. I think like throughout my time management has probably been one of the biggest things, because I've always liked doing multiple things rather than just sticking with one thing, since I have always felt like me doing 2 things at 80% was still more helpful to PFF than me doing one thing at 100%. And especially like with fantasy football, there's a very clear time of the year where people care a lot more about fantasy football than the other half of the year. So being able to find something to do during the other half of the year. So I think it's making sure what I'm doing is something that I enjoy doing, since a lot of the time the changes in my career have been more based on what PFF has needed at the time, more so than this is what I want to be doing. So trying to stay vocal about what I want to be doing while also trying to help PFF, since like the fantasy thing mostly came about because we had people who left PFF and we had a void there. And software development was something where I didn't go to college to be a software developer. I was learning SQL basically on my own. I was learning R in order to do more of the analytics work. And we had so many of these software developers who that's what they did for a career. They didn't know as much about football, where I knew the football, didn't know as much about the software development, and thought that would be a good pairing. So one of the bigger challenges, as well as just time management in general, was trying to learn software development from scratch and get myself as up to speed as I possibly could with people who this is what their career is, this is what they're doing throughout the entire season and what they went to school for. And I have no idea what I'm doing. So trying to get that without the educational background. And part of it was just a confidence thing as well, of like, sometimes we're hiring people, sometimes we're turning away people who have a ton more software development experience than I have. But it's like, no, I still provide something to this team that they need me for, even though there's so many things that they can do and that they all can do that I can't do.
Well, you kind of mentioned I'm more of a film guy than an analytics or numbers guy. And the math checks out there. I mean, 80% plus 80%, that's 160%. That's 60 more percent than 100%. So I get it 100% here with that answer. Now, we kind of talk about being a math teacher and maybe a football coach is maybe a path that you could have seen yourself going down if you didn't find yourself in this line of work. So I want to take both of those off the table right now. And I'm going to take fantasy football off the table. Where are you going to find yourself? Are you maybe a stunt double for the Power Rangers in the night? Like, where are we going here? Where could you see yourself if those are all off the table as options?
So, yeah, I think we have to take basically anything football related off the table, because like I could go back to data collection. I could stick with software development for PFF. I could work for a team. I could do plenty of things in football. Like going back to actuary science is probably the biggest thing, even though I had only been a major for about a year or so and then took an internship in it. Just being able to do something with mathematics and applying it to something is an intellectual challenge that I enjoy. So even though I love doing that for football a lot more than everything else because of my enjoyment in the sport, so I can combine two things, but anything that's related to doing some kind of math puzzle, it doesn't necessarily need to be actuary related, but something that has to do with numbers, like accounting, I'm not sure I would enjoy all that much, even though a lot of that's with numbers, but I'm sure like industries everywhere are changing all the time that a lot of places care about numbers for various things. So I know I'd find something, but it would be definitely something math related.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen that a lot of businesses have kind of gone with a more value on the numbers here, especially with today's day and age and everything that's been kind of going on there. But we're kind of learning that as we go. And for me personally, I've kind of come to grips a little bit with there as a film guy. Like I said, there's a place for both in the same space. I mean, I don't think you could have the film guy versus the analytic guy anymore. I think there's a nice little happy medium when it comes to fantasy sports for both to kind of coexist. That's one thing that I've learned. Now, what have you learned through fantasy football? What has it really taught you about yourself?
I would say that it has taught me, one, it's shown some of my competitiveness, because I always knew that I was somewhat competitive in sports, but a lot of things with fantasy football, like, yeah, there's a competitive trying to beat your opponent, but especially the ranking accuracy stuff, how competitive I get there, since it's like when I do my home league, for example, I don't necessarily always want to win because it's like the expectation that I win because I do this for a job. They're all doing this for fun. And it's like, hey, if I win every time, it's no fun for anyone because it's expected that I win, and it's no fun for everyone else if they're always losing. So I enjoy when someone else is able to win those every once in a while, but especially when it comes to industry stuff of like, I get more competitive for those kind of things. So that's something that it's taught me. And I think probably something is how much more capable I am of learning things. I thought when I was done with school that like a lot of my learning would be done, but when it's come to things where like I need to learn something in order to be better at it so that I can be more helpful to the fantasy football people who follow me. So like having to learn more programming is something that I never thought I'd have to do, but I needed to do it in order to get better at fantasy football. And I did it for the fantasy football stuff more so than for the PFF stuff. And like getting better on video, like I have another random thing about me is I was involved with the forensic speech team in college and high school. So I did competitive public speaking. A lot of people did it because that's like a big strength of theirs and they enjoy doing it. Where for me, it was, this is a weakness of mine, speaking in front of groups or in public, and I wanted to get better at it. So like I already had somewhat of a background, but knowing that in order to be a fantasy football analyst, having a podcast is a pretty big deal for most everyone, needs to at least have some sort of podcast presence. So that's something that I also felt I had to get better at over time. So I think fantasy football has taught me that like I need to continue learning and continue evolving, where when I came out of college, I'm like, okay, I'm done with school. I more or less know what I need to know and I'm good to go.
Some of us need maybe a little less of a presence from time to time. I'm not going to point fingers at anybody, but I mean, it's funny you mentioned that learning always. I mean, I learned more about the technical aspect of basically everything between the ages of 30 and 40 years old, trying to start a website at like 35 years old without any expertise whatsoever. I mean, my job is basically making water freeze. I'm like a Zamboni driver by trade. Meanwhile, my 9-year-old is putting YouTube videos together by like, I mean, it's absolutely incredible. But that's where we've kind of come here, right? I mean, that's how things have changed. Now, when you talk about that competitiveness, now competition is good. I think competition can be healthy. So is there anyone in particular that you enjoy beating maybe a little bit more than anybody else, whether it's in a league or like you said, those accuracy contests?
Yeah, I think it's some of the guys that we were talking about at the beginning. It's the ones who are like consistently at the top, and it's always like a friendly competition as well. Like I respect those guys so much as well. So that's part of why I enjoy getting ahead of them, is because I respect them so much. So that's a nice thing about the fantasy football industry, is like basically everywhere you look, there's not, I don't recall any like huge beefs that people have had with each other in the industry that have gotten like really public, that you'll see in other industries where people just don't like each other. Like, yeah, I'm sure there's people out there that don't like other people, but I think there's so much like friendliness in the community that's nice. But it's the guys that just consistently do well in the accuracy competitions, the Justin Boones, the Joe Bonds, Sean Kerner as well. I think I missed his name before, but he was the one who won the whole thing last year and got first in running backs and wide receivers, which is so difficult to do. So if I am able to surpass him this upcoming season, I'll be excited about that. But he's been great at this for a long, long time.
I think it was Rob Wozniak that actually texted me when I finished second that 1 year. I didn't even know that it happened. I had no idea, because apparently these come out for the draft like in July, August, sometime in there. Completely like you're not even thinking about it anymore. So I didn't even know this was still a thing. Like I totally thought about doing my draft rankings. Yeah. He's like, hey man, I just want to give you a heads up that it's not official yet. They haven't announced it yet, but it looks like you finished second. Like, nice. In what? Finish second. So I mean, yeah, like you said, everyone's kind of like, hey, those are the great relationships. Those relationships are important. So we kind of threw some names all throughout the show here, but who are some people that maybe you respect more than others that have kind of helped you get to where you are today, helped develop you into the analyst you are?
Yeah. So I think when I was thinking about this earlier, a lot of it is people that aren't necessarily in fantasy football, but people at PFF in general. Neil Hornsby, who was the founder of Pro Football Focus, that was the CEO for the company for a long time as well. He gave me so many opportunities throughout my time at PFF. Like, I'm not all that surprised that I got brought on initially just because of how much they needed people. But over the time, as the company grew, and once Chris bought the company, the number of opportunities that I had in order to like prove myself, and not just prove myself, but be able to move around and do different things, even though they knew I was valuable in other areas. Like I was heavily involved in data collection, but then I started doing other things. Like when it came to the 0 to 100 grades that we have at PFF, I did all of the math behind taking the raw grades that our analysts get and turning that into the 0 to 100 number. So like getting an opportunity to do those kind of things and really start the data science team within PFF. So getting those opportunities and then just trusting me as well to get involved with software development, or trusting me with fantasy football when we had other people leave, of like, hey, even though we just had you start this software development stuff, we also need you for fantasy, and trusting me with those things. So he was a great person to work for a number of years, and would not have stuck with PFF for as long as I did if it wasn't for him. Another name that people are less likely to know, Ian Perks, was the first software developer at PFF for the first at least decade of the company. He was the only software developer at PFF, but he mentored me a ton when it came to both before my time being a software developer, helping me learn more about the data that we have, how I can access our data and be able to do what I need to with it. A lot of it came with the 0 to 100 grades, but I had been doing everything in Excel, and Excel has a limit of 1,000,000 something rows. And I'm like, I need more than 1,000,000 rows for some of this stuff I'm doing, and needed to learn how to go around those obstacles. And then just starting as a software developer, by that time he had a fairly not large team, but team of, I don't know, 20 or so people. But the amount of time that he spent with me, helping me learn, especially early on, but he did this for a lot of people, helping them learn within PFF. So he's helped me a ton in terms of fantasy football. Like, it's been great to work with people like Mike Clay and Jeff Radcliffe, but for them, it's like their time at PFF was the start of their fantasy football careers as well as the start of mine. So like, I'm not sure I'd really call them my mentors, just because they were learning on the fly as well. And I know they've done plenty of things to mentor people they've worked with throughout the rest of their careers as well, and they were great to work with. But it's really some of the guys that have been at PFF for a long time. Ben Stockwell, Collett as well, both on the data collection side. Spent a ton of time learning from them, and they both still lead the data collection. They've been at the company longer than I have, and they're still doing the same things that they've been doing, getting close on 20 years now.
That's a long time in itself. Now, I'm always learning. I am. I know I have a lot to learn when it comes to numbers and the fantasy data mining going on there. But hey, I'm always willing to learn to be a better parent as well. So hey, I've got like 12 kids here. Nathan, give me some parenting advice. What do you got for me?
I'm probably not the best person here, because I do not have kids. I don't even have pets, and not planning on having kids. So I'm not the great. Take my advice with a grain of salt here, but I'd say just make sure you allow them to follow their passions. Like, I know early on people need plenty of advice on how to raise someone, but if they find something that they like, just make sure that you're being as supportive as you can with it, because who knows where it could lead.
Hey, Nathan, I'm not going to say nothing here. You don't have to say any names on this here, but I'm sure you have some adult children you have to work with somewhere along the line here as well. Now, last question before I let you go. One last piece of advice for anyone trying to get into this industry, whether that's on the analytical side, whether that's on the film side, whatever side that happens to be, help them get in.
So in terms of getting in, it's hard for me to like feel genuine when I'm giving that kind of advice, because I'm like, get lucky, find a company right before they're about to get big and jump on at that point so you can ride that wave. But in terms, I would say, if you think you have an idea that's good, believe in yourself and put time into that. I think an example I have there is the recap articles that I do, where I have those out immediately after games. And I'm like, it took a little bit of convincing of the editors of like, hey, I know it's time on the editor's side to do this, but I think this could be a really big thing. And I believed in that idea of the recap articles, even though there weren't really the type of recap articles that I was writing at the time, since I focused so much more on, here are how the players were used, here's how the rotations went down, here's how this impacts these players going forward, where a lot of other people focus more on, here's who did well, here's how many fantasy points they scored. Maybe some focus on like the injuries and what those kind of things mean going forward, but I look a lot more at like the tight end rotations and running back rotations and how things changed ever so slightly from the previous week. So I think if you have an idea that you believe in, make sure that you're following that passion, because that's probably a way to differentiate yourself from others in the industry. Because if it's an idea that you have that maybe others don't have, that's probably a good way for you to differentiate yourself. And with so many people wanting to do this, that's something that you probably need to do at least at some point. It doesn't necessarily need to be immediately when you're starting out. Definitely try to do a lot of things when you're starting out, but once you have an idea that you feel really attached to, go for it.
All right. And hey, I'm going to give you the floor here. So go for it, Nathan. Let the people know where they can find you. What do you got coming up next here with PFF? What do you guys got going on over there?
Sure. So social media, find me at PFF_Nate Jahnke, last name spelled Jahnke. At PFF, really starting in about July, maybe a little bit earlier, we'll start having a lot more fantasy articles, a lot of the things that you would expect with rankings and sleepers and breakout players. Something that I started to do a little bit last year that I'm planning on investing more in this year is player-specific articles. Digging more into stats that I haven't been looking at as much in the past, whether it's separation percentages, rushing yards over expected, looking more at like which wide receivers are the X receiver versus Z receiver and what that means for players. So we have all of that at PFF coming very shortly.
And with that all being said, this has been another episode of Behind the Grind. And I got one last thing to say before we leave. Go, Nathan Jahnke. We'll see you next week. Take care.